they didn't teach you this version in Sunday school. There's a protocol to divine positioning, a pattern so precise that ancient scholars who studied it could identify when someone was being placed, not just present. When your ordinary life is secretly a stage being set, when what looks like luck is actually something else entirely. Her name was Hadassah, nobody, an orphan twice over. First, she lost her parents to causes the text doesn't name. Then she lost her homeland when her people were dragged into exile, strangers in Persia's shadow. She lived in Susa with her cousin Mordecai, a minor official who had taken her in out of duty that slowly became love. They were survivors. That's what you did in the empire. You kept your head down. You used your Persian name. You didn't draw attention to the fact that you were Jewish. Hadassah means myrtle, a modest plant, fragrant but unassuming. Her parents named her for resilience, for the kind of beauty that doesn't demand to be noticed. But Mordecai also called her Esther, star, as if even then someone knew she would shine in places too dark for ordinary light. She was maybe 20 when the decree went out. Every beautiful young virgin in the empire was to be brought to the palace. King Xerxes needed a new queen after Queen Vashti's very public refusal to be paraded before drunk men had cost her the crown. The kingdom needed to see that defiance had consequences, that order would be restored. Hadassah didn't want to go. She had seen what happened to girls who entered that palace. Most were forgotten, kept in luxury, but never seen by the king again. Their lives suspended in a golden cage. A few became favorites for a night, a month. None of them got to choose. The night before the soldiers came for her, she lay awake in the small room she had known since childhood. She could hear Mordecai breathing in the other room. Steady. Safe. Tomorrow she would leave this house, this life, everything familiar. And she had no say in it whatsoever. I don't want to be beautiful, she whispered into the darkness. Beauty was a commodity in the empire, a thing that happened to you, that made you useful to powerful men. She wanted to be invisible. Invisible meant safe, but when the soldiers came, she went. Because what else could you do? The palace was a different world. Marble columns that reached toward heaven, gardens with flowers she had never seen, gold everywhere, casual and excessive, the kind of wealth that doesn't even notice itself anymore. The other girls whispered and competed, forming alliances, sabotaging each other's beauty treatments. Everyone knew only one would be chosen. The rest would spend their lives in the harem, technically royal property, but functionally forgotten. Haggai, the keeper of the women, noticed her immediately, not because she campaigned for his attention, because she didn't. While others demanded the finest oils and the most elaborate preparations, she simply asked him what he thought would be best. This small act of humility in a palace of grasping ambition made her unforgettable. He gave her the best rooms. Beauty treatments spanned 12 months, with 6 months dedicated to oil of myrrh, which softened and perfumed the skin, followed by 6 months of spices and cosmetics. Ancient Jewish sources suggest myrrh had properties beyond fragrance, being used in burial preparations as a symbol of death and transformation. For 12 months, Hadassah died to her old life, was prepared like a body for burial, so that something new could emerge. She never told anyone she was Jewish. Mordecai had been clear about that. Your name is Esther. Your people are Persian. Your faith is private. It wasn't shame, it was strategy. In the empire, being different was dangerous. Being Jewish was a liability that could cost you everything. Every day, Mordecai would walk past the courtyard of the harem, trying to catch news of her. He couldn't speak to her, couldn't protect her. He could only pace, pray, and position himself where information flowed freely. The king's gate was the place he chose, where officials gathered, gossip circulated, and anyone paying attention could learn valuable things. Unbeknownst to him, he was also positioning himself for something significant. When Esther's turn came to go to the king, she didn't ask for elaborate jewelry or excessive makeup. She wore what Haggai suggested: simple, elegant, confident without demanding. She walked into the king's chambers, not as a girl trying to win a competition, but as a woman who knew her worth without needing to prove it. Xerxes saw hundreds of beautiful women. Beauty was common in the palace, but there was something about this one, a quietness that wasn't timidity, a grace that didn't perform. When he looked at her, he didn't just see a beautiful face. He saw someone he wanted to know. He loved her more than all the others. The text is specific about that. Not just attracted, not just impressed. He loved her, and he set the royal crown on her head, making her queen in place of Vashti. There was a feast, a holiday declared across the empire, gifts distributed, and in the middle of all the celebration, Esther stood in robes she had never imagined wearing, a crown heavy on her head, and felt utterly alone. She was queen, but she was still hiding, still pretending, still living behind a name that wasn't fully hers, in a role she hadn't chosen, in a palace that glittered with wealth but felt cold at night. Mordecai still came to the king's gate every day, still positioned where information moved. And one day, he overheard something that changed everything. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, were angry about something. A slight, a missed promotion, some petty grievance that festered into rage. They spoke in low voices, thinking no one important was listening. They were planning to assassinate the king, to poison him or ambush him. The details were vague, but the intent was clear. Mordecai didn't hesitate. He sent word to Esther immediately, and Esther, who was still learning how to navigate palace politics, went straight to the king. Mordecai has uncovered a plot, she said, not taking credit, not playing games, just delivering information that could save his life. The king investigated. The eunuchs confessed under interrogation. They were hanged. And in the Book of the Chronicles, the official record of the kingdom's significant events, a note was made. Mordecai the Jew uncovered a plot against the king's life. But strangely, nothing else happened. No reward, no promotion, no public honor. Just a note in a book that no one would read for years. The moment passed. Life continued. Esther thought it was over. A crisis averted, a life saved, a debt acknowledged. She had no idea the record of that moment was a seed planted, that years later, in the middle of a sleepless night, that seed would crack open and change everything. Time passed. Xerxes promoted a man named Haman to the highest position in the kingdom. second only to the king himself, and he issued a command. Everyone must bow when Haman passes. Not just respect, full prostration, the kind of honor usually reserved for kings or gods. Mordecai refused. Day after day, Haman would pass through the king's gate, and every official, every servant, every person in sight would drop to the ground, except one. Mordecai would stand, not defiantly, not making a scene, just standing, because Jews didn't bow to men like gods, didn't give that kind of worship to anyone but the Holy One. Haman noticed. Of course he noticed, and it ate at him. This one man's refusal became an obsession. Who was he? Why did he refuse? And when Haman learned that Mordecai was Jewish, something dark shifted in his mind. Why punish one man when you could destroy an entire people? Haman cast lots, in Persian, to choose the perfect day for genocide. The dice fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, almost a year away. Time to plan, time to prepare, time to make sure the destruction would be total. He went to the king with practiced words. There is a certain people scattered throughout your empire. They keep themselves separate. They have their own laws. They don't follow your laws. It's not in your interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will personally put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury to pay for it. Haman was literally paying for the privilege of genocide. Xerxes barely looked up. He pulled the signet ring from his finger and handed it to Haman. The money is yours to keep. The people are yours to do with as you see fit. Just like that. No investigation. No questions about which people or why. Just casual permission for mass murder because a trusted advisor suggested it. The decree went out to every province in every language. On the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, every Jew, young, old, women, children, was to be killed. Their property could be seized. This wasn't war. This was an extermination, legal and official, sealed with the king's ring, making it as unchangeable as the laws of the Medes and Persians. When couriers raced across the empire with the news, Susa fell into confusion. Some people celebrated the decree, while others were left horrified by it. But for the Jews scattered across 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, it was the end of the world. Mordecai heard the decree read aloud in the streets of Susa. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and walked into the city wailing. The sound that came out of him wasn't dignified. It was animal. Primal grief for a people marked for death. Across the empire, Jews were doing the same, fasting, weeping, crying out to a God who had allowed them to be scattered among nations and now seemed to be allowing those nations to destroy them completely. In the palace, Esther heard that Mordecai was in mourning. He refused them. So she sent a trusted servant, Hathach, to find out what was happening. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree, told him everything, and then sent this message back to Esther. Go to the king, beg for mercy, plead for your people. When Esther heard this, her first response was pure fear. Everyone knows the law. Anyone who approaches the king without being summoned is put to death. The only exception is if the king holds out the golden scepter. and I haven't been summoned for 30 days. She wasn't exaggerating. The law was absolute. The king's private chambers were protected by a death penalty. Even the queen couldn't just walk in. Xerxes could be kind, but he was also the man who had banished his previous queen for one act of defiance, who had just signed a genocide decree without asking questions. Going to him unbidden could cost Esther her life, and there was something else. Something she didn't say out loud, but that pulsed beneath her words. If she went to the king and pleaded for the Jews, she would have to reveal that she was one of them, the secret she had kept for years, the identity she had hidden to survive. She would have to unmask herself in front of the most powerful man in the world and hope he didn't feel betrayed. Mordecai's response came back through Hathach, and it was brutal in its clarity. Don't think that just because you're in the palace, you'll escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you stay silent right now, deliverance will come from somewhere else. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, maybe you were made queen for such a time as this. For such a time as this. 5 words that changed everything. Esther sat alone in her chambers. The crown felt heavy. The silk robes felt like chains. She had spent years surviving by being invisible, by not drawing attention, by playing the role she was given. And now Mordecai was asking her to risk everything. No. Not asking, telling her, you were positioned for this. She thought about the path that had brought her here. Orphaned, exiled, taken to the palace against her will, given favor she didn't seek, made queen in a competition she didn't want to enter. Every step had felt random, unfortunate or fortunate depending on the day, but always random. But what if it wasn't? What if Vashti's refusal had opened a door specifically for her? What if her beauty was a tool, not a trap? What if being in the palace wasn't imprisonment, but positioning? The idea was terrifying, because if she was positioned, then she had responsibility. She couldn't hide, couldn't stay silent, couldn't let her people die while she sat safe behind palace walls. She sent a message back to Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews in Susa, and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days. My maids and I will do the same. And then I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. If I perish, I perish. The concept of 3 days holds significance in ancient Jewish tradition, marking the boundary between life and death. Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, and prophecies often speak of resurrection after this period. Esther was choosing 3 days because she needed to die. Not physically, but the girl who wanted safety had to die. The queen who played it safe had to die, so that someone new could rise. Someone willing to say, if I perish, I perish. For 3 days she fasted. No food, no water, just silence and prayer, and the slow, painful process of accepting that her life might end in 72 hours. She rehearsed what she would say to the king. The words dissolved on her tongue every time. How do you tell someone you've been lying to them for years? How do you ask them to overturn a law that's already been sealed? By the 3rd day, something had shifted. She wasn't less afraid, but the fear had transformed into something else. Clarity, purpose, a strange peace that came from accepting the worst outcome. Because here's what she understood now. If she stayed silent and survived, she would have to live with the knowledge that she had let her people die to save herself. And that was a death worse than anything Xerxes could do to her. On the third day, she dressed in her royal robes, not the comfortable ones, the intimidating ones, the ones that said, "I am queen. I have authority. I belong here." She walked through the palace halls, each step a prayer, each breath a choice. Servants and officials stopped to stare. She never walked like this, with this kind of purpose. She reached the entrance to the inner court. Through the doorway, she could see Xerxes on his throne. He was reading something. Hadn't noticed her yet. This was the moment. The invisible line between life and death. Persian law said that crossing this threshold without permission meant execution. She stepped forward. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 lifetimes. Nothing happened. Then Xerxes looked up, saw her standing there. His face was unreadable. Every official in the room froze. They knew the law. They knew what should happen next. Then, slowly, deliberately, the king extended the golden scepter toward her. The relief that flooded through Esther wasn't just about survival. It was confirmation. She had taken the risk, crossed the line, and the author of this story had moved the king's heart at exactly the right moment. She walked forward and touched the tip of the scepter, the gesture that said, "I accept your mercy. I acknowledge your power to give life or death. What is your request, Queen Esther?" Xerxes' voice was warm, almost amused. "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Half the kingdom, it will be granted." Hyperbole, but the point was clear. He was pleased to see her. Whatever she wanted, he was inclined to give. And Esther, who had spent 3 days preparing to beg for her people's lives, said something completely unexpected. "If it pleases the king, come today to a banquet I have prepared for you, and bring Haman." A banquet. Not a plea, not tears, not an immediate request, just an invitation to dinner. The king agreed immediately. Intrigued by her boldness, her composure, the way she had risked death just to invite him to a meal. That night, at the banquet, Xerxes asked again, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" "It will be granted." "What is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be done." And again, Esther deflected. "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, come again tomorrow to another banquet I will prepare, and then I will answer your question." She was stalling, but not out of fear, out of strategy. Women who survive empires know that timing is everything. She needed to wait for the right moment, needed to let the king's curiosity build, needed something else to happen first, though she didn't know what. She didn't know that at that exact moment, God was orchestrating something in the shadows. That night, King Xerxes couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, mind restless for reasons he couldn't name. When sleep wouldn't come, he did what powerful men do when bored. He called for entertainment. Bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles. Read to me about the history of my reign. Servants brought the massive scrolls that recorded every significant event of Xerxes' rule. Victories, appointments, threats averted. They began to read, and in the middle of the night, they read an entry from years ago about a man named Mordecai, the Jew, who had uncovered an assassination plot, who had saved the king's life. The entry was brief, clinical. Xerxes stopped them. What honor or recognition has been given to Mordecai for this? The servants checked the records. Nothing has been done for him, Your Majesty. Xerxes sat up. How was that possible? Someone saved his life and received no reward, no position, no wealth, not even public acknowledgement. The oversight offended him, made him look ungrateful, made him look like a king who didn't value loyalty. At that moment, Haman entered the outer court of the palace. It was early, barely dawn, but he couldn't wait. He had built a gallows 75 feet high in his courtyard, specifically for Mordecai. Today, he would ask the king for permission to hang the Jew who refused to bow. Get rid of this irritation once and for all. But before Haman could speak, Xerxes called him in. Haman, I need your advice. What should be done for the man the king especially wants to honor? Haman's heart soared. The king wants to honor someone? Who else could it be but me? His mind raced through possibilities, each more grandiose than the last. For the man the king wants to honor, Haman said slowly, savoring the moment. Have them bring a royal robe the king himself has worn, and a horse the king has ridden with a royal crest on its head. Give the robe and horse to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Perfect, public, humiliating for everyone who wasn't being honored. Haman could already see himself on that horse. Xerxes smiled. Excellent. Go at once. Get the robe and the horse. Do exactly what you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Don't neglect a single detail. The world tilted. Haman's smile froze on his face. Mordecai, the Jew, the man he hated. The man he was about to ask permission to kill. He was being ordered to honor him publicly, to dress him in royal robes, to parade him through Susa proclaiming his greatness. The irony was so perfect it felt authored. Haman had no choice. He did everything he had described. Led Mordecai through the streets on the king's horse, shouting about his honor. Every step was agony, every word ash in his mouth. When it was over, Mordecai returned to the king's gate as if nothing had happened. But Haman went home in shame, his head covered in mourning. He told his wife and advisors what had happened. They looked at each other with something like fear. If Mordecai is Jewish, and this is how things are beginning, you won't be able to stand against him. You're going to fall. Before Haman could respond, the king's eunuchs arrived to escort him to Esther's second banquet. At the banquet, Xerxes asked for the third time, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be granted. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be done." And this time, Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, Your Majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." The king's expression shifted. Confusion, shock, your life, your people. "We have been sold," Esther said, her voice steady despite the terror beneath it. "I and my people. We're going to be destroyed, killed, annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would have kept silent. But we're facing destruction, and that's why I must speak." Xerxes' face darkened with rage. "Who would dare do such a thing? Where is the man who would threaten you?" Esther pointed. Her hand didn't shake. "The adversary, the enemy, this wicked man Haman." The room went silent. Haman's face went white. The king erupted from his seat and stormed out into the palace garden, too angry to speak, needing air, needing space to process the betrayal. Haman saw his death in the king's eyes. He threw himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, begging for mercy, grabbing at her robes in desperation. At that moment, Xerxes returned, saw Haman on top of his wife, and exploded. "Will he even assault the queen while I'm in the palace?" The words were barely out of his mouth before guards covered Haman's face. The gesture meant death. One of the eunuchs spoke up. "A gallows 75 feet high stands at Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to save your majesty." Xerxes didn't hesitate. "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. The weapon he had prepared for someone else consumed him instead. Every plan he had made reversed. Every step toward power became a step toward destruction. But the danger wasn't over. Haman was dead, but his decree was still law. In Persia, once a law was sealed with the king's ring, not even the king could revoke it. The 13th of Adar was still coming. The Jews were still marked for death. Esther approached the king once more, falling at his feet and weeping. "Please stop Haman's evil plan. Prevent the destruction of my people." The king extended his scepter, allowing Esther to rise. Then Xerxes made an unexpected offer. "Write another decree in the king's name and seal it with my ring. Anything written in the king's name and sealed with his ring cannot be revoked, so write whatever you think best." He was giving them permission to counter the genocide with another law, a loophole in the unchangeable. Mordecai summoned the royal scribes immediately. In the king's name, he issued a new decree stating that the Jews in every city have the right to assemble and defend themselves. They are permitted to destroy any armed force that attacks them and take the property of their enemies. The decree was translated into every language and sent to each province. Where there had been mourning, now there was joy. Where there had been darkness, now light. The impossible had happened. The death sentence had been transformed into permission to fight back. On the 13th of Adar, the day Haman had chosen through casting lots, the day that was supposed to be the end of the Jewish people, they rose up instead. Across 127 provinces, Jews stood together and fought. They struck down 75,000 enemies. In Susa, they killed 800, including Haman's 10 sons. But here's the detail that matters. They took no plunder. The decree gave them permission. The wealth of their enemies was legally theirs, but they took nothing, because this wasn't about gain. It was about survival, about justice, about proving that they fought to live, not to profit from death. The day after the battle, they rested, and what had begun as a day of dread became a day of celebration. They called it Purim, after the Pur, the lots that Haman had cast. The dice he threw to choose the day of destruction became the name for a day of deliverance. Every year, Jews would remember this moment, would feast and celebrate and give gifts to each other and to the poor, would tell the story of how one woman's courage changed the fate of a nation. Mordecai was honored throughout the empire. He wore royal blue and white, a crown of gold. He became second in rank to King Xerxes. But it wasn't the power that made him great. It was what he did with it. He worked for the good of his people, spoke up for the welfare of all Jews, used his position to protect those who had no position. And Esther, Queen Esther, she lived the rest of her life knowing what it meant to be positioned. Years later, according to Jewish tradition, young women would come to her with questions. How did you know? How did you know it was your moment? And she would smile, that same quiet smile she wore the day she crossed the threshold into the king's court. And she would say, I didn't know. I was terrified, but I recognized the pattern. When you're in a position you didn't earn, facing a problem you didn't create, with a skill set that seems oddly specific for this exact situation, that's not coincidence. That's positioning. She would lean forward, her voice dropping. The question isn't if you're positioned. We all are. The question is, will you recognize it? Will you act? Or will you play it safe and let the moment pass? The women would leave changed, not because she preached at them, but because they saw in her story the outline of their own. Here's what the story of Esther reveals. God's name never appears in the entire book. Not once. His fingerprints are evident everywhere. In the timing, in the coincidences that aren't really coincidences, and in how every obstacle transforms into an opportunity. Each crisis becomes a doorway. Vashti's refusal cleared Esther's path, and Esther's beauty opened the king's heart to her. Mordecai's position at the gate gave him access to information. The assassination plot created a debt that would be repaid at exactly the right moment. The king's insomnia, the timing of Haman's arrival, the gallows built for Mordecai becoming Haman's own execution, every detail fitting together like a pattern, too perfect to be random. Esther didn't feel qualified. She was an orphan, a foreigner, a woman in a patriarchal empire. She had every reason to stay silent, to stay safe, but she understood something that changed everything. Your fear doesn't disqualify you. It makes your courage meaningful. Your weakness doesn't eliminate you. It makes space for a power greater than your own. Your ordinary life isn't evidence of insignificance. It's the stage where extraordinary purpose is revealed. Maybe you're listening to this and wondering why your life has taken the turns it has. Why certain doors closed. Why others opened unexpectedly. Why you ended up in a position you never planned for, facing a challenge you never wanted, with skills that suddenly seem remarkably relevant. Maybe that job you didn't expect to get, that relationship that changed your trajectory, a crisis in your community that you can't ignore. Maybe none of it is random. Maybe you're positioned. The God who placed an orphan girl in a palace to save a nation, the God who turns what's meant for destruction into deliverance, the God whose name is silent but whose presence is undeniable. He's still writing stories of redemption through unlikely heroes. Perhaps you are where you are for such a time as this, not by accident, not by chance, but by design. The question is, will you recognize it? Will you risk comfort for purpose? Will you say, like Esther, if I perish, and step across the threshold into your moment, because the pattern is still happening?